October 29, 1888. The air in the Dakota Territory had the sharp, clean bite of an unsheathed knife, a promise of what was gathering just over the northern horizon. Annalise Finch knelt in the hard dirt beside her cabin, her knuckles raw and chapped. In her hand, she held her late husband's folding rule, its brass hinges stiff with the cold. She was not measuring lumber or marking a cut. She was pressing the edge of the rule into the damp clay she had dug from the creek bed, testing its depth, its consistency. The thick, grey mud clung to the wood, a second skin. Around her, the aspens had shed their gold, leaving a stark forest of bone-white trunks against a slate-grey sky. The world was preparing to sleep, or to die, and Annalise was preparing with it. She worked with a slow, deliberate rhythm that defied the urgency of the season. Dig, haul, mix, and measure. It was a language of labor her body understood better than words. The good people of Providence Creek, what few there were, saw a widow's grief turn to madness. They saw a woman scrabbling in the dirt, defiling her own home. What they did not see was the memory of a grandmother's voice, a low murmur from the Appalachian hills, speaking of winters that could crack stone and freeze a man's heart in his chest. A person does not fight the cold. They persuade it to go around. The work was a prayer made of earth and water. Each trowel of mud slapped against the pine boards of the cabin was an act of faith, a denial of the fate everyone had already written for her. When her husband, Thomas, had taken his last shuddering breath that spring, the pneumonia rattling in his chest like stones in a dry gourd, the town had offered its condolences. They came in the form of pies and platitudes, their faces arranged in masks of solemn pity. But their pity had a short shelf life. As summer faded, it curdled into a kind of wary impatience. A lone woman had no place here. The land was too hard, the winters too long. Her presence was an untidy loose end, a problem they wished would resolve itself. Annalise knew this. She felt it in the way they averted their eyes at the general store, in the sudden silence that fell when she entered the post office. They were waiting for her to fail, to pack her meager belongings and retreat back east to whatever family she had left. But she had no one, and this small plot of land, with its stubborn pines and rock-strewn garden, was the only thing Thomas had managed to leave her. It was all she had. So she did not weep or beg or explain. She simply picked up her shovel. True survival is a quiet affair, conducted far from the opinions of others. Deacon Hemlock arrived on the first day of November, his buggy throwing up clods of frozen mud. He was a man built of stout timber and unshakable certainty, his face a testament to a life free of doubt. He did not get down from his seat, but looked upon her work with a pained expression, as if witnessing an act of profound indecency. Annalise was hauling a bucket of slurry, her dress hemmed with mud, her face streaked with it. She set the bucket down and waited, her silence a wall he would have to breach on his own. "Mrs. Finch," he began, his voice oiled with a practiced sympathy that did not reach his eyes. "The Council of Elders is concerned for your well-being. This activity. It is not seemly. It speaks of a mind undone by sorrow." He gestured with a gloved hand at the half-coated cabin, a lumpy, monstrous thing against the clean lines of the prairie. Annalise simply watched him, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She offered no defense. Therefore, he was forced to continue, his tone shifting from paternal concern to business. "The winter will be here soon. A hard one, the natives say. There is no shame in admitting you cannot face it alone. The church has authorized me to make you a fair offer for this land. Enough to see you settled with your people back in Ohio." The offer was not fair. It was an insult, barely enough to cover the cost of the lumber in the cabin itself. It was an offer made to a person with no other choice. But Deacon Hemlock had misjudged her. He saw a fragile widow. He did not see the iron in her spine, forged in a childhood of Appalachian poverty and tempered by the loss of everything she had ever held dear. "I am not cold, Deacon," she said, her voice low and even. "And I am home." He stared at her for a long moment, his certainty flickering. He saw no tears, no desperation. He saw only a woman standing beside a half-finished wall of mud, her gaze as steady and unyielding as the northern horizon. "As you wish," he said, his voice clipped. Do not say we did not try to help. He turned his buggy and rode away, leaving Annalise alone with the rising wind and the immense, silent weight of the coming winter. The confrontation had not frightened her. It had hardened her resolve into something akin to stone. The work became her entire world. From the first pale light of dawn until the stars glittered like ice chips in the black sky, she moved between the creek and the cabin. The physical toll was immense. Her back ached with a fire that never cooled, and her hands, even protected by worn leather gloves, were a geography of blisters and cuts. The mud was a living thing, heavy and recalcitrant. She learned its nature by touch, the exact ratio of straw and water needed to make it bind, the way it stiffened and cracked if the air was too dry, the way it slumped if too wet. She was not merely covering the cabin, she was creating a new structure around it, a shell of earth that followed the contours of the wood. In her small, leather-bound ledger, next to columns of dwindling expenses, she made notes passed down from her grandmother. Clay from a deep bend in the creek holds the heat best. Mix with last year's reeds, chopped fine. 4 inches is good, 6 is better, 8 is a fortress. The people of Providence Creek had built their homes from the forest, felling the great pines and notching them together with pride and precision. Theirs was a war against the wilderness, an act of conquest. Annalise's work was different. It was an act of communion. She was borrowing the strength of the earth itself, asking the ground to become her shield. She was not building a wall against the winter, but a burrow within it. The town saw her toil and shook their heads. The poor woman's lost her senses, they'd murmur over coffee at the mercantile. Grief does strange things. They saw her as a cautionary tale, a ghost already haunting the edges of their well-ordered lives. They could not comprehend that her strange labor was an act of profound sanity, a calculated response to a threat they were all underestimating. They trusted their axes and their saws, their stacks of cordwood and their thick stone chimneys. Annalise trusted the dirt beneath her feet. One afternoon, a man appeared at the edge of her clearing. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in buckskins that had seen more seasons than he had words. It was Josiah Reed, a trapper who lived so far up in the hills that he was more rumor than man. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he moved through it like a shadow, his eyes holding the vast, empty stillness of the high country. He did not approach her directly but stood by the tree line, watching her work for a long time. Annalise did not stop. She continued her rhythm, hauling the sled of wet clay, working it into the wall with her trowel. She felt his gaze but was not threatened by it. It was not the judging stare of the townspeople. It was a look of quiet assessment, the way a man might study an animal track or the grain of a storm cloud. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even of approval. He then turned and vanished back into the trees as silently as he had arrived. The next morning, she found a bundle on her doorstep. Inside were 3 thick, perfectly cured beaver pelts and a small sack of rock salt. There was no note. None was needed. It was a transaction of respect between 2 people who understood the brutal arithmetic of survival. His visit, brief and silent as it was, fortified her more than any spoken encouragement could have. It was a confirmation that she was not mad. Someone else saw the logic in her labor. Someone else knew what was coming. That recognition was a small, warm coal she carried inside her as the days grew shorter and the mud on her cabin walls began to freeze almost as soon as she applied it. The race was against the frost. A hard freeze would turn the creek bank to iron, sealing away her primary resource. Every day, the sun rose later and with less conviction, a pale wafer in a washed-out sky. The nights were now so cold that a skin of ice formed on her water bucket inside the cabin. Annalise began working by lantern light, her shadow a dancing giant against the lumpy, organic shape her home had become. The walls were now over a foot thick in most places, the window openings like deep-set eyes in a golem of earth. The roof was the final, most difficult challenge. She built a shallow frame and packed it with a dense layer of sod and clay, leaving only a small opening for the stovepipe, which she extended with a section of scavenged tin. The cabin was no longer a cabin. It was a mound, a hillock, a man-made burrow that seemed to have grown from the landscape itself. From a distance, it almost disappeared, blending into the dun-colored grasses and the gray stone of the hills. The final layer went on during a day of spitting snow and a wind that tore at her clothes. Her fingers were numb, her movements slow and clumsy with exhaustion. As she packed the last trowelful of mud around the base of the door, a profound sense of finality washed over her. It was done. For better or worse, her fortress was complete. She stumbled inside, barred the heavy door, and collapsed onto her cot, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke filling her lungs. She did not know if it would be enough. But she knew she had given everything. She had built her hope out of the very ground that would one day claim her. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, the first real blizzard of the season began to fall, its flakes not gentle or soft, but hard and sharp like grains of sand, scouring the world clean. The storm was not a storm. It was a physical entity, a white beast that descended upon the plains and stayed for 12 days. The wind did not howl, it shrieked, a constant, high-pitched scream that vibrated through the frozen earth. Snow fell in a blinding, horizontal torrent, erasing the sky, the horizon, the entire world. It buried fences, then sheds, then entire wagons. Providence Creek, which had felt so secure in its sturdiness, was being dismantled. The wind found every crack in the log walls, every gap in the mortar. It drove fine, sharp snow into pantries and parlors, dusting floors and furniture with a layer of impossible cold. The temperature dropped to 30, then 40 below zero. Wood that was meant to last for months was consumed in weeks as families huddled around their stoves, feeding the flames in a desperate, losing battle against the encroaching frost. Inside her earthen shell, Annalise experienced the storm as a distant rumor. The screaming of the wind was muffled to a low, deep hum. The crushing weight of the snow on her roof only served to pack the sod tighter, to increase the insulation. Her small stove, burning only a few logs a day, kept the single room at a constant, livable temperature. It was dark, the only light coming from her lantern or the red glow of the stove. It was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the sound of her own breathing. It was a tomb, but it was a warm tomb. She spent her days in a state of quiet suspension. She mended her clothes, read the few books she owned by lantern light, and ate sparingly from her stores of salted pork, beans, and dried apples. She thought of Thomas, not with the sharp pang of fresh grief, but with a dull, settled ache. He would have hated this confinement. He was a man of the sun and the sky. But he would have understood what she had done. He would have called it clever. The isolation was a heavy blanket, but she did not feel fear. She felt a strange and profound sense of peace. She had trusted an old wisdom, and it was holding her. She was an anchor of warmth in a world that had frozen solid. In Providence Creek, the battle was lost. The first to die was old Mr. Abernathy, his heart giving out as he tried to chop a frozen log. Then 2 of the Miller children, taken by a fever that burned through their small bodies. The town doctor was helpless, his medicines frozen solid in their bottles. Deacon Hemlock's grand house, the pride of the town, became his prison. A section of the roof, groaning under a 4-foot drift of snow, collapsed, exposing a bedroom to the blizzard. His wife, frail and asthmatic, sickened within a day. The deacon, a man whose faith had always been as solid and unyielding as a granite rock, found himself praying with a desperation he had never known. He prayed for deliverance, for a reprieve from the relentless cold that was seeping into the very marrow of his bones. The community, once bound by a shared sense of propriety and purpose, fractured into isolated pockets of fear. Families kept to their own homes, hoarding their firewood, their concern for their neighbors extinguished by the more immediate need for their own survival. They had placed their faith in sword lumber and civic order, and the wilderness had simply shrugged and buried them. The widow Finch was forgotten. They assumed she had been the first to perish, a quick and merciful end in her flimsy cabin. Her strange, mad project of mud and straw was likely the first thing the storm had scoured away. Her death was a settled fact, a sad but inevitable postscript to the town's founding story. When the wind finally stopped, the silence was more shocking than the noise had been. A bright, merciless sun shone down on a landscape that was utterly transformed. It was a world of white, a place of smooth, flowing dunes and alien shapes where a town had once stood. The snow was packed as hard as cement, 15 feet deep in the drifts. Doors were buried. Windows were sealed. Providence Creek was a collection of tombs. It took 2 days for the survivors to begin digging themselves out. Men, their faces gaunt and blackened with frostbite, emerged into the blinding light. The scale of the devastation was absolute. Half the livestock was frozen in the barns. The mercantile's roof had caved in, burying most of the town's remaining food supplies. Of the 27 households, smoke rose from only 9 chimneys. Deacon Hemlock, his face a mask of grey despair, organized a small party of men. Their first grim task was to check on the silent homes. Their second, more an afterthought, was to make their way to the Finch place. "We should at least give her a Christian burial," the deacon said, his voice hoarse. "It's the least we can do." A young man named Peter, whose mother had always insisted on sharing her bread with Annalise, spoke up. "Maybe we should dig first," he said quietly. The deacon looked at him, his eyes hollow. The thought that she might have survived was too absurd to contemplate. Yet, they set out, wading through drifts that were taller than a man, the sun on the snow so bright it hurt to look at. The journey was a slow, exhausting struggle. What was once a 20-minute walk took them 2 hours. As they crested the last rise, they stopped and stared. Where Annalise's cabin had stood, there was only a large, perfectly smooth mound of snow, a drift like any other. It was exactly as they had expected. They stood there for a moment in the profound silence, a small knot of black-clad figures in an endless expanse of white. The deacon removed his hat, preparing to say a few words. But then Peter, his eyes narrowed against the glare, pointed. "Look," he whispered. From the very top of the mound, a thin, almost invisible wisp of grey smoke was rising. It coiled lazily into the still, frigid air, a sign of life so impossible it felt like a hallucination. For a moment, no one moved. They simply stared at the impossible plume of smoke. Then, as if breaking from a trance, they scrambled forward, falling and stumbling in the deep snow. They began to dig at the base of the mound with their bare hands, then with shovels they had carried. The snow was packed and heavy. It was like digging through rock. They dug with a frantic, desperate energy, fueled by a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrible shame. They clawed away the snow until they hit something hard and dark. It was the top of her door frame. More digging revealed the door itself, caked in a frozen layer of mud and ice. Peter used the head of an axe to hammer at the edges, cracking the seal of ice. With a final, collective heave, they pulled the door open. A wave of warm, earthy air washed over their frozen faces. And in the doorway, framed by the darkness within, stood Annalise Finch. She was holding a lantern, its gentle light illuminating her face. She was thin, her features pale, but her eyes were clear and steady. She was alive. She was warm. The men stood frozen, their mouths agape, their faces a mixture of awe and profound guilt. They looked from her calm face to their own frost-bitten hands, from the quiet warmth of her home to the frozen ruin of their own. Deacon Hemlock, the man of unshakable certainty, stumbled forward and fell to his knees in the snow. He was not a man given to grand gestures, but the world had been turned upside down. The weak had endured while the strong had been broken. The foolish had been wise, and the wise had been fools. "Mrs. Finch," he began, his voice cracking, a dry rasp. We thought you were." He could not finish the sentence. Annalise looked down at him, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a great and weary stillness. "I was warm," she said. The 2 words were not an accusation. They were a simple statement of fact, and in their simplicity, they carried the weight of a final judgment. She then looked past him to the other men, their faces etched with the hardships of the past 12 days. "The fire is lit," she said, her voice even. "The broth is hot. Come inside." She stepped back, holding the lantern high, and one by one, the men of Providence Creek, the same men who had pitied and scorned her, ducked their heads and entered the widow's earthen burrow, seeking salvation from the cold. They found not a hovel, but a sanctuary. It was small and smelled of dirt and smoke, but it was a haven of life in a world of death. A pot of thin rabbit stew simmered on the stove. Her small ledger lay open on the table. They saw the neat columns, the careful notes, the evidence of a plan they had been too blind to see. Annalise ladled broth into tin cups and handed them to the men. They drank it down, the warmth spreading through their frozen bodies. No one spoke. There were no words for the shame they felt, nor for the gratitude. They had come to bury a madwoman and had instead been rescued by a prophet. In the days that followed, Annalise's mound became the heart of Providence Creek. She shared her food, her warmth, and more importantly, her knowledge. She showed them the notes in her ledger, explaining the principles of insulation, the way the earth holds its heat against the bitterest air. She taught them how to mix the frozen clay with snow and straw, how to pack it into the breaches in their own walls. She worked alongside them, her small, steady presence a constant source of quiet strength. The townspeople, humbled and desperate, followed her instructions without question. The social order had been shattered by the storm. In the new world, competence was the only currency that mattered. Deacon Hemlock's wife, tended to by Annalise with poultices and warm blankets, began to recover. The deacon himself seemed to have shrunk. He worked quietly, hauling buckets of slurry, his face a constant mask of contrition. One evening, he found Annalise alone, checking the mud pack on what remained of his house. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the ground. "It is not mine to give," Annalise replied, not looking up from her work. The winter came. It did what it does. Her mercy was more devastating than any revenge could have been. It left no room for argument or self-pity. It simply was. And in that, he finally understood. The world was not governed by piety or position. It was governed by immutable laws of heat and cold, of life and death, and Annalise Finch understood those laws better than any of them. As the last of the snows melted and a pale green returned to the ravaged landscape, a new community began to form, one built not on judgment, but on the shared memory of a terrible winter and the quiet wisdom of the woman who had survived it. The mud on her cabin, mixed with the seeds of the prairie grasses, began to sprout. Her small home grew a living skin of green, becoming one with the hill it stood on, a silent testament to the enduring strength that lies not in fighting the wilderness, but in becoming part of it.